we are here today to learn about Scrum, right? To really get into the nitty-gritty details of how Scrum works, why it's set up the way it is, so that we can use that to answer questions like we get in an exam. Also for things like interviews, job performance reviews, that kind of thing. These might be useful skills. But the idea here is for us to really get a deep, deep understanding of the Scrum framework itself. What that means is that we are not here today to challenge Scrum or to discuss whether Scrum is correct or not correct in the things that it talks about. Not that those aren't potentially useful discussions. And as those of you who know me, you'll know that I'm not a person that thinks that you should just follow Scrum for the sake of it. But given the purpose of this event and to understand Scrum and how it works, we just really need to stick to, is it Scrum or is it not Scrum, not whether or not that's useful guidance in any particular kind of contexts. Like I say, this is about problem solving. So what I don't want anyone to think of as they come into this session is that this is about getting a shortcut to get your PSM3. Because to be honest, PSM3 is hard. Other exams like that are likely to be equally hard, I would imagine. And you're not going to be able to just attend one of these and then suddenly have a quick way to pass that exam. What we're trying to do here is really get you into that deep understanding of Scrum and better prepare you to think about things in a really complex way. So while I am hoping that a lot of you will kind of come to a few of these sessions and then feel confident and be able to pass something like a PSM3, that's not the only thing that we're going to be focusing on here. It's about actually getting that deep understanding. In order to support that, this is going to be a lot about us learning to tell a story. As those of you have tried it or have seen examples of PSM3 questions, you'll know that they are essay format. So it's about telling a story in a lot of ways. And what that means is that we need to practice that skill of talking about how we might solve problems, how we might identify issues. And the reason that's really, really important and counterpointed by that red sticky that says we're not here to blame or attack is because there are often going to be no correct answers, but there are often going to be wrong answers. And we need to be able to be honest about that and talk about that, right? So if you say something that may be a valid thing to say, to do in the real world, but that doesn't, for example, align with Scrum language or doesn't align with the practices of Scrum, we all need to be able to call each other out and talk about that and talk about why, even if we don't agree with it, for example, you might lose a mark on a Scrum exam. And so we need to be open to that kind of discussion. And like I say, this is all for the purpose of helping us to become better Scrum Masters, which means that we can't be here just to protect our egos. We are all going to say stuff that is wrong. I have no doubt that at some point I'm going to say something and use the wrong language, something out of date from an earlier version of the Scrum Guide, or inadvertently say daily Scrum, for example. We need, to say daily stand-up instead of daily Scrum. We need to be able to call each other out on that and not get upset when we are wrong, because we're all going to be wrong sometimes, and that's totally fine. Quickly jump then onto the next frame, because I think it's worth getting into what we'll actually be talking about today. So this is a really useful framing mechanism. It's a pyramid of learning, which is a bit of a simple way to kind of describe this. But it's an understanding that different levels of learning require different approaches, different thought patterns. And you can really think about that ladder from PSM1 to PSM3 as essentially a way of moving up this pyramid. This is important because PSM1 is really only checking your ability to remember and loosely understand the Scrum Guide, right? You're going to be, remembering what the artifacts and events and accountabilities are. You're going to be talking about time boxes. That's what PSM1 cares about. And that's important knowledge for you to have. But this session and ultimately passing the PSM3 exam is not going to be about your ability to have a greater ability to remember or understand the Scrum Guide. That's kind of just the first step. What we're really trying to do is move up through this apply and analyze lens, which is really where PSM2 sits, right? Do you understand how to actually apply these things, how these approaches and techniques work in the real world? And then today for PSM3, we're really into this top section, which is evaluate and create. So in order to really get a handle on Scrum, what it is, why it is, you need to be able to evaluate why the Scrum Guide is set up as it is, justify the decisions that you might make when using it, thinking about defending particular viewpoints or arguing or judging against different viewpoints. And when I mentioned before, there are no right answers, but there are wrong answers. That's important because some of the ways that we will practice, right, that we will get into this deep understanding of Scrum is by taking a position and arguing for it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there is a single right answer, but that very act of going through the kind of thought process and the articulation of, you know, why something is or isn't true, or why Scrum is set up in a certain way, will hopefully help us to get that understanding. And then finally, there's that creative aspect, right, which really comes into how you might apply Scrum in the real world beyond just the basic elements of it. But, you know, if you're with a real team in a real organization, what would you do to solve particular problems in a creative way? And that's what PSM3 is really looking for when you go through those sorts of essay questions. Now, again, I have to reiterate, I'm not the person who creates the PSM3 exam. I'm not the person that will grade it. So I can't ultimately give you yes or no answers to whether something is or isn't going to be, you know, successful in an exam like that. What I can tell you as someone who's been through the PSM3 exam and, you know, has thought about this a lot, is that you will often get marked down for very minor, you know, incorrect use of language, or for not being clear enough in referring to the Scrum guide. And the best way to make sure you don't make those sorts of silly mistakes is not to work on memorizing the Scrum guide. It's to work on really deeply understanding how those things connect. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. We're going to use dysfunction mapping as a backdrop today, as in terms of how we think through how to answer these these Scrum style questions. Again, some of you may not be super familiar with dysfunction mapping, and that's fine. We're not here today to learn this process. I did send out a video and a article that you hopefully read in advance, so you've got enough of a baseline understanding. If you don't, then we'll just have to figure out as we go today, and hopefully as you kind of practice this technique, it'll start to make more sense. But I wanted to just give a brief crash course on the flow of dysfunction mapping so we're on the same page as we use it later. This is just a visual tool that helps you identify potential problems in a team or in an organization, and then work backwards to figure out an action that you can take to solve or to have an impact against that problem. So it actually flows from the right to the left. We start on the right-hand side here with symptom. And the way this is going to work as we go through, as you'll see later, is when you get something like a PSM essay question that proposes an example problem for you to solve, you'll be pulling the symptoms out of that and putting them on this dysfunction map, and then trying to identify where you think the dysfunction is. So what is the, you know, the part of Scrum where we might be doing something wrong, or we could improve something that could have an impact on those symptoms. We're then going to talk about purpose and how particularly you would use Scrum language to understand why those elements of Scrum exist, and then a solution and action that we can take that might solve the problem. And then finally, there's a space there for measures. Now, the PSM3 exams, from what I recall, don't generally expect or ask for you to measure things as part of those long form questions, but there will be questions about metrics and measurement, generally in multi-choice, sometimes in the form of an essay question. So I've left this part here because I think it's still a worthwhile thing for us to be thinking about is, well, how do we measure change when we're potentially helping a Scrum team? Again, this is not about doing dysfunction mapping in and of itself. This is just a backdrop that I'll give you an example for in a sec, and we will talk through how that actually works. What I'm hoping this gives you is a kind of structure that you can follow probably in your brain, right? Because in the exam, you're going to be time limited. You're not going to be able to actually kind of form a whole dysfunction map. But by practicing and doing this over and over again, I hope that you'll kind of build this kind of mental model, this heuristic pattern that you can quickly go through and go from, you know, what's the problem to what am I going to do about it in a way that will really align with that Scrum language. So like I say, symptoms are about understanding negative outcomes that can be seen or observed. So from the perspective of, you know, a Scrum example question, this is going to be the stuff that they give you in the question usually. Dysfunction is particularly rules that we are breaking in Scrum, right? So if, for example, we don't set a sprint goal, or we don't have a product owner, those are things that Scrum says we should do. If we don't do them, that's a dysfunction. Purpose is for us to decide, but it's essentially the why. Why does Scrum have these rules? Why do they exist? What's their purpose or value? The solution is the action that we're going to take to help fulfill the purpose. And then the measure is, as you can probably guess, the thing that we're going to measure that hopefully will improve. But they loop back to the symptoms, which again, I'll talk about a little bit later. As we talk through these steps, I wanted to kind of talk about the examples that I'm going to give and how this is important as we reflect on the Scrum guide. Because that symptom step, as I mentioned, that's going to be just what they give you in the question a lot of the time, right? That's going to be fairly obvious. But when we talk about dysfunction, for this event, for the purpose of passing a Scrum exam, we really want to hone in on the Scrum Guide itself. So the best and most useful thing you can do is read the Scrum Guide, right? And I know that all of you here have probably read the Scrum Guide many times, but it's always worth reading it again anytime you are not 100% crystal clear on why or how Scrum is structured the way it is. Read the Scrum Guide again. It's always going to be useful to you. But for the purpose of sort of this heuristic pattern that we're going to be learning, this repeatable approach, these cards that come from my wider dysfunction mapping set are really, really useful because they capture all of the core elements of Scrum. So you can see here that I've got the 3 commitments: sprint goal, product goal, definition of done. I've got the events, so daily Scrum, sprint planning, sprint review. I've also got backlog refinement on there, which isn't actually an event. We have to just maybe make that clear so it doesn't get anyone into trouble. But just for the purposes of this, simplification, it should be included. Refinement is an important thing. You can see the accountabilities. I've added stakeholders and customers, which come up repeatedly in the Scrum Guide. And then, of course, the artifacts, the 2 backlogs, and the increment. And the point of this, the reason I'm calling all these out is because whenever we're talking about where the dysfunction might lie, we're almost certainly going to be reflecting on one of these elements, right? If there's a problem with a Scrum team, at least from Scrum's perspective, the answer is going to be one of these elements of Scrum, right? So if we're struggling to get work finished, it might be something to do with our refinement or our planning. If we're struggling to collaborate, it might be something to do with our daily Scrum or our product owner or our developers. Again, there's not necessarily a right answer to any of these things, but oftentimes the wrong answer is not to reference any of these things, right? If you go outside of the Scrum Guide, it's a big risk. Now, it's not to say that it's not okay to mention supporting structures, additional things outside of Scrum. That's totally fine. But you probably want to be doing that less often, probably considerably less often than you're actually referencing the core elements of Scrum, because more often than not, those minimum things are all you need to solve the problems that Scrum, PSM3 and Scrum exams are going to be looking for. How we think about things like purpose and problem solving. Because again, PSM3 and any of those sorts of exams, they're going to really, really care about you using specific Scrum language and talking the way that a Scrum practitioner is expected to talk, which means often talking about the pillars of empiricism, right? Transparency, inspection, adaptation. Again, I hope you're all very, very familiar with what they are and you don't need me to explain those to you or why they're important. But often when we're explaining, what we're going to do and why, or why we're, leaning on certain Scrum events, we don't actually explicitly mention these things, and we almost always should. And that's one of the tricks that I'm hoping you're going to learn as we go through this. I shouldn't say tricks, but it's a useful mental tool, is to always think about how something supports empiricism. Does it create transparency? Does it create an opportunity for inspection? Does it allow us to adapt something? Because articulating that is a step towards passing that exam. It's at least going to be worth a couple of points in most cases. The same goes for the Scrum values. Criminally overlooked by a lot of Scrum Masters. We don't talk about these often. And again, for exams, these are going to be super, super important. So if we're asking things about, purpose, like why is the daily Scrum a 15-minute time box, or, why is the sprint goal a part of the sprint backlog? There is a very, very good chance that you're going to be thinking about these values in your answer, right? Is it to do with focus? Is it to do with commitment? Is it to do with openness? Again, not necessarily a right answer, but a wrong answer is often going to be skipping these entirely. And so you're almost always going to want to reference that particular Scrum language. And above that, thinking about what you're actually going to do. This is what Scrum Mastery is all about, right? So you can see the cards I've got here for the 6 stances of a Scrum Master, which is an article by Barry Overeem. Hopefully a lot of you know. And also I've included 2 elements of the coaching wheel from Simon Rydell and Stephanie Ockerman's Mastering Professional Scrum book, which is very similar to the 6 stances, but they add a couple of extra things. And so I've included those there with actively do nothing and point north. There's a good reason I call these out, right? And that's because these are official scrum.org materials, right? So Barry Overeem's 6 stances, the coaching wheel in the Mastering Professional Scrum book. These are scrum.org agreed ways that Scrum Masters can act and solve problems, which is to say, if your solution uses one of these stances or one of these approaches, it's probably going to be seen as a good answer. Again, that doesn't mean that not using these is bad. That doesn't mean that you can't do things that don't explicitly fall into one of these categories. It just means that you should be thinking more often than not about leaning on these. And again, if we talk about being able to more quickly come to a solution, these are really good, useful lenses, right? Because you can look at a problem and say, could I act as a mentor? Could I act as a teacher? And that gives you a much quicker path to, here is a solution that I would propose to the problem, right? Which is really what we're looking to get at here. Brilliant. All right, so let's put a bit more context in this, and hopefully it'll all start to be a bit clearer now. So if we go over to frame 8, here is an example of a PSM3 question, not from the real PSM3 exam because I'm not allowed to copy those, but from Simon Neefsey's practice questions. Simon is one of the few PSTs that I know that does spend a decent amount of his time and energy on helping people pass PSM3. If you don't know him, you can go to, I believe it's thescrummaster.co.uk. And you can see a bunch of amazing supporting materials there. And so if you're looking for things like a practice assessment or a downloadable pack of practice questions, you can buy those from his website, and they are fantastic. I highly recommend checking those out. He has also given me a discount code. So that big, long, annoying string of text that you can see at the bottom of the frame, that is a discount code that you can use on his site to get 25% off of those. So yeah, copy that if you're thinking about getting these. But this example question we've got here, right, it says, you are a Scrum Master working with a Scrum team. The developers constantly complain that requirements are not clear enough. The product owner claims that she is too busy to provide extra clarity. What should you do? So this is the sort of question you're going to get in a PSM3 style exam, right? It's going to be, not a clear, here's an exact answer that you should give. It's asking you to think critically about the problem that you've been given and decide what you're going to do about it. And then how you justify that, how you articulate it, and what language you use will be worth certain numbers of points that, again, they don't make super transparent to us. So the first thing that essentially I'm teaching you to do is to read that question and look for the symptoms. What are the actual problems that it's asking you to solve, right? Here, I've called out two particular things. So one of those is obvious, which is, well, developers are complaining that requirements are not clear enough, right? That's fairly clear in that question. But the one that's maybe a little bit more hidden there is that the product owner is too busy to support the team during the sprint. And you could articulate that in a number of ways, but that in and itself is a problem, right? And this is something that's going to be a theme in a lot of the questions you'll see, is that there's an obvious problem, but it's not necessarily the only thing you need to solve. There's maybe something a little bit deeper hidden there. And in this case, it would be easy to skip the fact that the product owner is too busy, but you have to ask, well, what's the accountability of the product owner? What's their role in Scrum? How do they interact with the Scrum team? And is it actually okay that the product owner doesn't have enough time to support the team with answering questions? Because that in itself, gives us something we want to solve. So for today, what we're going to be doing is essentially a little activity where we're going to have another question like this, a different question later that you guys are going to get. And the first thing you're going to do is try and pull out these symptom cards. You're going to essentially write your own versions of these, a couple of stickies that say, right, here are the problems that we're trying to solve. Now, as we go through this session each month, I'm hoping that we can actually transition away from me giving you specific questions, because I've actually got 150 of these symptom cards predefined, hidden away in a board of mine, that eventually I think I can just give to you all, so that you can just shuffle a deck, pick a couple at random, and then, hey presto, you've got your own pretend Scrum problem to solve. And suddenly you've got an almost infinite number of imaginary questions you can generate for yourself to practice this. So that's what I want us to get to. But that would probably be a bit overwhelming to start with today. So we're going to use example questions instead. And hopefully as we go through multiple sessions, this will become easier and easier. But just to reiterate, right, these example questions, the first thing you're going to want to do is identify what are the problems that I'm trying to solve here, and capturing those in 2 or 3 stickies, cards, whatever you want to call them, that then act as the base into the next part of your dysfunction map. What we then will do is think through this flow that we talked about in the dysfunction map. Now, again, the exact, what dysfunction mapping is and how it works, you don't need to stress too much about, but the process that we're really trying to get at is, right, given those symptoms that I've identified, where in Scrum would I be looking for dysfunction? And so in this case, where the developers complain that requirements are not clear enough, and that the product owner is too busy to support the team, well, my immediate thought is, well, backlog refinement is probably the place in Scrum where we expect to understand the requirements of the work. And so there's something there, right? Probably, are we doing it enough? Are we doing it in the right way? Maybe. The product goal comes into my mind because actually requirements shouldn't really matter that much, right? In Scrum, we're about aligning to goals, not to particular requirements for work. And so maybe the problem here is that the team doesn't have a clear product goal, and so without explicit requirements, they struggle to know how to make decisions. So that's another potential problem to solve. And then finally, I've selected the product owner because, well, obviously they're a bottleneck of some kind here. There's some challenge with the product owner. And I've simplified this down into a Scrum dysfunction that I have kind of described as the product owner is not a member of the Scrum team, because that's what Scrum tells us, right? The product owner is a member of the team, but if they're behaving not as a member of the team, if they're not present, if they're not available when they're needed, then they're breaking that rule of Scrum. That feels like a place where we can solve a problem. Now, again, this isn't a right answer. You might come up with a completely different set of, places that you would look, or a completely different set of dysfunctions here, and that's fine as well, as long as you can justify them in the context of the Scrum guide and what it says, and that you're not just kind of making it up as you go along. Because then that's the next step is, well, we want to think about why these things exist in Scrum. So why does backlog refinement exist? What's the purpose of it? Why does the product goal exist? What's the purpose of it? And this is where we need to start thinking about those values and principles. And so the three that I've selected here as I've thought through this problem are openness, because in this case, it feels like actually openness between the developers and the product owner is going to be key, talking about what the challenges are. I've talked about transparency because I feel like transparency of the goal and where we're going is important. And I've talked about commitment because commitment to the goal is important. Again, not right answers, but they're also not wrong answers, which is a good first step. And once I've done that, I can start thinking about, well, what am I going to do as a Scrum Master? Which again, if I lean on these stances or these decisions, that's going to mean that I'm probably not going to go too far off the rails and lose a bunch of points by giving a bad answer. And so in this case, I've gone with the change agent stance because I've thought, well, maybe I could propose an experiment. I've gone with point north because I think reminding the team of the product goal could be a useful thing to solve this problem. And the impediment remover stance, because it sounds like the product owner potentially has some impediments in place, which is why they don't have time for our sessions. So that feels important to me. There's also these measure cards. Again, we don't need to worry too much about these, but I've thought about, well, how would I check to make sure that this is actually having a positive impact, right? If I do some stuff, and I thought I might want to survey the team, and I might maybe want to check each day if the team is talking about the product goal or getting work done. So what we don't want to do is get into trying to say, oh, the product owner is dysfunctional, right? That's not going to be helpful. But it might be useful to think that there is a dysfunction with regard to how we're utilizing the product owner accountability, how we're supporting the product owner. That's kind of where we want to go with this. So yeah, it's not about blame. It's just about understanding where we think, we might be able to address a problem. Just to reiterate then, so that kind of flow that I've just described, right, how I've selected these pieces, that then gives me a structure that I can use to actually answer the initial question, right, which if you recall was about, developers complaining about requirements, product owner being too busy, what are you going to do? And so by taking all those elements that I've captured, I have then written this little story that's in the blue box. I'm not going to read that out to you. I'll leave it on screen so you all can read it. But this now gives you an example of a way that I might answer a PSM3 style question. Now, again, it's not perfect. I cannot guarantee you that this is, an answer that would score you maximum points on a PSM3 exam. But I can tell you from experience that it's going to hit a lot of the right notes to be, a good go at that question, right? It's going to mention the stances, it's going to mention the values, it's going to solve the problem. And because I talk about measurements even, it's going to show you're valuing empiricism, right? And actually measuring and seeing what's happening with your actions. Now, again, this activity, if I actually go through the process of thinking about all the cards, every single step, is going to take a long time. And I'm probably not going to be able to do that for every question in an exam. So I don't want you to see the purpose of this as being to learn how to follow this structure exactly. It's just to use the structure as a way to practice that thought process of getting to an answer, because the more you do it, the easier it gets, and the less you'll have to start thinking explicitly about, these cards and this structure. It's more about building that shortcut in your brain to more quickly get to those answers.